Welcome to the show. I'm Shawn Drotar. This is Sandy Clough, Sandy and Shawn on Mile High Sports. You can watch the program on YouTube, probably where you're doing that right now. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a lot of things to get to today. Of course, look at the Denver Broncos. We'll take a look at the Denver Nuggets and what they'll have to deal with in free agency with our friend Arran Andersen from Fox 31. And we'll take a look also at not only what the Avalanche need, but the Colorado Rockies, as well as a significant change in baseball history happening today. You don't want to miss that. But we'll start with the Denver Broncos, Sandy. You have talked about this for most of last season and for all of this offseason. And now the folks at Pro Football Focus agree with you. Today on their story, the idea was they went through the entire rosters. Now, only about a week ago, we talked about Pro Football Focus that said the Broncos had the worst quarterbacking situation in football, something that I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think it's great, but I don't think it's the worst. However, it's
just unproven.
It's unproven. But I think there's some promise there that maybe a couple other teams like the Raiders don't necessarily have a ceiling there that's any higher than the Broncos. But it's not good. This one I agree with because we've talked about it for a while. Pro Football Focus ranked all 32 teams on the quality of their rosters from top to bottom. The Denver Broncos came in 32nd out of 32 teams. And get this, when they list their biggest strength, they called it the offensive line.
I don't say the offensive line is necessarily their biggest weakness, but it sure as hell isn't their biggest strength. I hope. Now, if their offensive line is their biggest strength, I don't know that I want to hear about their greatest weakness.
Well, I'm going to make you eventually anyway. But here's what they said specifically about that. Other than its center, which is up in the air after Lloyd Cushenberry's departure, the Broncos have a well-rounded offensive line. Quinn Miners was a breakout star last season, posting an 83.7 grade that ranked third among guards.
He was. They have one good guard.
One.
Among five offensive linemen.
Garrett Bowles and Mike McGlinchey form one of the more solid tackle duos in
Durable.
the league, they say,
Durable.
Which will be huge for rookie quarterback Bo Nix. Center is the biggest question mark. The Broncos don't feature anyone with significant NFL experience on the roster. The current expectation is the 2022 fifth-rounder Luke Wattenberg will take over the role, but he has only 129 career snaps to his name, and those came primarily at guard. We also know that Alex Forsythe, seventh-round pick out of Oregon last year, and a free agent Sam Mustipher and Calvin Throckmorton also are in the mix. Mustipher has the most experience centering for the Baltimore Ravens last year and earlier in his career. So I get that offensive line at least has continuity. We talked yesterday about the Colorado Buffaloes trying to microwave a new five-man starting unit. In this case, the Broncos' continuity is more or less intact, although trying to find a new center isn't necessarily easy.
No, and highly questionable, I think. Although you got a new quarterback. However you cut it, you got a new quarterback.
Right.
Now, we think we know who that new quarterback
we know who
should be, but injuries could always,
barring injury,
change the scenario.
Right.
So, I don't think the scenario is in question. Bo Nix is going to be the starting quarterback. I think you agree with me on that.
Of course.
My biggest question about the Broncos roster, apart from its quality, and I don't know if it's the worst. I haven't done the kind of analysis that obviously they do at Pro Football Focus.
Fair enough.
32 teams.
It's in the bottom five.
But it's in the bottom five.
It's not
in terms of roster quality.
Strong, right.
My quibble about the offensive line being listed as a strength, and even any aspect of the offense at this point being an established strength, is that I think you've seen such a roster kind of turnover, maybe a better phrase would be roller coaster, that it's impossible to determine exactly how various parts of the offense align when it comes to team building. You've got a brand new quarterback, but precious few receivers, tight ends, I think with the exception of Franklin, as receivers go, non-existent exposure to Bo Nix.
Right.
And they're generally older guys who've been around for a while. Some are newcomers to the scene here. But I wonder if the talent aligns with the time frame with respect to Nix. Now, I think the time frame with Nix is going to be accelerated, one, because Sean Payton has no choice, and two, because Bo Nix is 24 years old, played in 61 college games. You don't see a lot of 24-year-old rookie quarterbacks come through the NFL. You don't see any rookie quarterbacks in the history of football who started 61 college games. It's never happened before. So I understand that Nix isn't your typical rookie. However, when you look at the entire roster, I wonder if and when the offense begins to blossom, maybe this year, perhaps next year is more realistic, then the defense begins to falter, and you begin to worry about age on the defensive side of the ball and holes on the defensive side of the ball. In an ideal world, you have your offense, your defense, even your special teams kind of growing at the same time, ascending all at the same time. You don't have certain aspects of the roster ascending while other aspects are descending. And I think the Broncos have more of a problem with what we'll call the roster roller coaster, perhaps, than any other team. I don't know that that makes the quality of the roster the worst in the league, but it is the most, I'll use my word again, unproven when it comes to how things will coalesce with, as you pointed out, a veteran offensive line, at least at 4 of the 5 positions, expected to start the season in front of a rookie quarterback and perhaps a rookie 1-2 punch at the running back position.
Also possible. The question I guess I would have, Sandy, is when you talk about the roster roller coaster, when you talk about the idea that this team has had so many rotations in and out, we're not only including, of course, prior to Sean Payton, the addition of Russell Wilson, the fact that Payton and Wilson didn't get along, the Broncos take the biggest dead cap hit in the history of the NFL in order to move on from him. We see Justin Simmons released, obviously, arguably the Broncos' best football player last year. And it's one of the reasons that when you talked about, you didn't want to hear what they said that the weakness would be at Pro Football Focus. It is, according to them, it is defense. And their argument is that without Pat Surtain, or at least outside of him, there really aren't any significant playmakers. They look back at that 70-point loss to the Dolphins and realize that.
And by the way, Surtain played in that game.
He did. Simmons did not. Simmons came back and the defense got better, something that they note as well. They said Vance Joseph managed to do damage control and reorganize the defense in a more favorable manner, but there are a lot of holes that weren't fixed. Don't expect any miracles in 2024. That's a challenge too, because if you're defense is going to backslide.
So they're saying the entire defense
is the biggest weakness.
Is the biggest weakness
because there's a dearth of playmakers.
Not
and
linemen,
I think that's
linebackers, defensive backs, just the defense in general.
One word.
That is not
defense.
Good news.
That's what they consider the biggest weakness. But who are the playmakers? Jonathan Cooper had a nice year. Nick Bonito had nice moments, but he's not even expected to be a starter.
Surtain's not a playmaker.
He's not a playmaker. Your best playmaker was Simmons. He's gone. You've had moments. The Broncos are counting on Cooper, Bonito, Baron Browning to create a pass rush. They're hoping for bounce back years from Zach Allen, the addition of John Franklin Myers to go. But again, these aren't guys that are renowned around the league as playmakers.
They're solid players.
They're solid players with promise, but we talk about this when you see it in baseball, right? When you have a team that gets excited about it, we have your Generation R with the Rockies a while back. You have 4 or 5 young players. Well, all 4 or 5 of those players are not going to all of a sudden be stars. It's not going to happen. So when you go young and when you go with a lot of guys that you believe their ceiling is high, and that's what you're counting on, they're not all going to hit their ceilings. They're not all going to mature at the same rate. They're not all going to become star players. And so for the Broncos, their pass rush has a lot of solid rotational guys that the Broncos appear to expect a few of them to become stars this year. And at least in my experience watching this, I don't see a lot of star power there. I think Bonito has talent. I think Baron Browning has talent. Are they stars? Are they going to become pass rushers that the teams worry about planning around, like Von Miller? I don't see it.
When was the last time the Broncos had a fat pass rush to be feared? I would submit maybe the 1 year that Chubb and Miller spent together.
Yeah.
Which was,
I can see that.
What, 2018?
Mm-hmm.
Am I right about that?
I believe that's right. And
so
that was just the 1 year. I mean, when you're talking about, and I get it, a pass rush is more than sacks. I do understand that. But the Broncos had in that year, in that 2018 year, 44 sacks. That was good for a top 10 position in the league, and only 8 behind the Chiefs and Steelers.
And that was going to be the pass rush for years to come, headed up by Miller
Right.
and Chubb, and it just didn't work out that way. They alternated season-ending injuries, and then in 2022, Miller was traded.
Right. So that was the last
Chubb
time.
Followed shortly thereafter.
In that 2020 season, they did end up in the top 10 with 42 sacks. They did sneak into that. Now, the Steelers, again, were atop the league with 56 and the Rams with 53. But a lot of that, again, ends up being Miller and company. Since that 2021 year, they were middling. Obviously, we know that in 2022, they were near the bottom. And at 2023, with a grand total of 42 sacks, they were just outside the bottom 10. And for that defense to pick up and become much more effective, because defense nowadays, let's face it, it's not about limiting points, it's about turning the ball over. And the Broncos have to find guys who will cause turnovers. And I get it. That's not all sacks, right? We understand that pressures cause turnovers. Sacks tend to cause punts. Pressures cause turnovers. And we're not really tracking pressures in traditional statistics, although Pro Football Focus, to their credit, actually does. But for the Broncos, their idea is they're going to keep sending waves of edge rushers. What happens if you keep sending waves is the idea that you're sending waves of fresh guys, whether it's Benito and Cooper and Browning, if and when he has an opportunity to get healthy Sanders. But in Jonah Ellis's case, they've added him.
Jonah Ellis is going to be part of the pack.
Right. Is throwing 4 or 5 fresh bodies over and over again at the quarterback enough to make up for the fact that there isn't a Max Crosby, a true star at the pass rush?
The only year, and you can go back and get the numbers, that I remember the Broncos having a pass rush without a premier pass rusher was 2005.
Yeah, you'd have to go way back.
When the leading sack artist might have had 4.5 or 5 sacks that year. John Lynch was among the leaders, if not the leader in sacks in 2005, but they had a very good pass rush because they had about half a dozen guys with, and they finished 3.5 to 6.
Yeah, but they finished in the bottom 4 in sacks at 28 that year. But
in 2005.
But again, pressures cause the turnovers. So there are ways to do this, but defense, I think, is a concern. It's an interesting point by Pro Football Focus. There was good news when you're talking about Bo Nix, who they called the X Factor, obviously, and a good argument that they make here. The Broncos selected some. I got flack for picking him a 12th decision, but here's what they say. There may not have been a better player-team draft fit. Sean Payton's West Coast offense fits perfectly with Nix's propensity for quick timing routes that Drew Brees used to work to perfection. As far as the scheme goes, Nix is in as good a position to succeed early in his career as any of the class's 6 first-round quarterbacks. I think that's quite possible. I think Chicago and Caleb Williams are set up better, but I don't think it's good in New England. Minnesota's got a pretty good opportunity for McCarthy.
Yeah. And I think Washington has a pretty good opportunity with Jaden Daniels to be pretty formidable because they've got weapons in place.
They've got
weapons. Washington, all they need is a quarterback, and I'm not saying Daniels will be a sensation right off the top of the season, but I think Daniels is equipped to have the best year of all the rookie quarterbacks. I think the floor is pretty high with Nix, but the ceiling isn't nearly as high with Nix as it is with Williams and Daniels. I agree with you on May. I didn't think May was the 3rd best quarterback in this draft. I don't know that he was the 4th best quarterback in this draft. He may have, of the top 6, been number 6. And New England, you talk about roster quality, especially in offense, not a lot there.
Well, weapons matter a great deal. We'll talk a little bit about what the Broncos have in their arsenal in a moment, but want to remind you that the 4th annual Colorado Whiskey Fest is coming to the Douglas County Fairgrounds on Saturday, July 13th. Food, wine, beer, and spirits vendors will be on site, including more than 50 different whiskey vendors. The festival is from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. It features live music from the Kevin Austin Band and Mojo Filter. Tickets are available online if you use promo code MHS. That's an easy one to remember, right? MHS. You'll save $15. Colorado Whiskey Fest is presented by the Whiskey Cartel. If you're 21 and up, you can get your tickets today at whiskeyfestcolorado.com. And remember, Use promo code MHS to save $15 on your tickets. Let's take a look at those weapons for the Denver Broncos, Sandy. And obviously, things get complicated at wide receiver, where Courtland Sutton is, I use the air quotes, holding out. You can't hold out from voluntary workouts. I get that. But teams look at it that way, despite the fact the Broncos have said, George Paton said that Sutton's in a good place. They're not worried about it until mandatory minicamp next month. I get that. But you talk about weapons, and here's what they had. Sutton led the team in receiving yards with 772. He led the team in touchdowns with 10. He was
there
actually
a team
near the league leaders in touchdowns.
Had a pass yardage leader in receptions that was below 772.
In this day and
I'm
age,
not sure there was. New England comes to mind as a possibility.
For sure.
Maybe New England.
And obviously the situation with Russell Wilson, that just did not work out.
And we know they haven't had a 1,000-yard receiver in almost as long a period of time as they've been going without a 1,000-yard running back.
But you go and look at that, Sandy. How about this? 28 receivers last year had more than 1,000 yards. 28.
And the Broncos didn't even have an 800-yard receiver.
No. As a matter of fact, Courtland Sutton, 772, comes in between Jacksonville's Christian Kirk and Indy's Josh Downs for 44th
Neither a number
most,
one receiver.
44th most in the league.
That's your leading receiver.
Yards. Now, to be fair,
that's why he's not getting a big
matters.
contract from the Broncos or probably from anybody else. The guaranteed money with Sutton is the whole issue. And I suppose the Broncos and Sutton could settle up on that. But prior to the mandatory minicamp, which is, 2 weeks away, approximately?
Yeah, almost exactly. Yeah, it's the 11th. So, yeah, just a little bit.
I don't see it, do you?
No. And
without it, I don't see him appearing.
Right. And the weird part is I don't see incentive for either party to budge. That's the complicated part, right? Courtland Sutton has 2 years remaining on his contract, $35.1 million remaining. As we tell you every time with NFL contracts, ignore that because NFL contracts are not guaranteed like every other sport. So he only has $2 million of those $35 million guaranteed. So if you're Courtland Sutton, I get it. 44th in the league in receiving is not all that impressive, but tied for 4th in the league in touchdown receptions is, especially from an offense that was not particularly
But the quarterback who threw him those passes isn't here anymore.
No, he is not. And now
he's not working out, and I know he doesn't have to, but he's not working out, and I guarantee he can say anything he wants. Sean Payton knows this and has been through it before with Michael Thomas in New Orleans. Two guys who were once very close, who, because of contract finagling, negotiations gone awry, became less than close, a lot less close than they had been before.
And again, Sutton is not a Sean Payton guy. We talked about that yesterday as well. Payton likes the people that he brought in, that he knows how to work with.
The Broncos have traded away Courtland Sutton's guys. Right. Two of them, one being Justin Simmons, who's been here for longer or had been here for even longer than Sutton had been here. And the other, of course, is Russell Wilson, who played for 2 years here and now is in Pittsburgh.
How about this challenge? Because I'm inclined to believe that Courtland Sutton would like to move on. He's been on a losing team for his whole career.
I think it is safe to surmise.
Yeah, he's bouncing around with quarterbacks. He'd like to go. Now, he can't get a massive increase, but the Broncos have no incentive to give it to him because, as you pointed out, he was barely in the top 50 in receiving, although the touchdowns are great. And if you're the Broncos, you look at it and say, well, if you hit all your benchmarks, you're going to make $35 million. So why do we need to give you a bump? So neither side has room to give entirely. Here's where the Broncos might. If Sutton does not report, if he's not with the team for any reason, here's the remaining performance numbers for the guys left. Josh Reynolds, the new addition from Detroit, had 608 yards last year and 5 touchdowns. Marvin Mims, returning rookie, a second-year player, 377 yards and a touchdown. Brandon Johnson, 284 yards and 4 touchdowns, second on the team, by the way. Little Jordan Humphrey, 162 yards and 3 touchdowns. If you were doing the math a little more quickly than I was, that means the remaining total yards last year, minus Courtland Sutton, for the wide receiving core with Jerry Jeudy out, 1,431. Total. Now, Tim Patrick is supposed to come back. He was injured last year. You have two receivers that are rookies in.
But Tim Patrick hasn't played in 2 years.
In 2 years.
In 2 years.
And you and I believed when you look at his contract that he's actually a bit of a long shot to make the team. He's not a Sean Payton guy. He hasn't played in 2 years. Peyton keeps bringing in guys like Philip Dorsett or David Sills, guys that he's a little more familiar with. I think Patrick's a long shot to make the team at all. But obviously, if you're Tim Patrick, you had to sign something so you can get out there and practice and show people you're healthy again and maybe land another gig. But I think the Broncos will move on. But they just don't have a lot there. You're really counting on Troy Franklin and maybe even Devon Veal to step up and as rookies and be really good. I know they're counting on Franklin, and they should. But this team doesn't have all that much. Mims is undersized. Is he talented? Yes. Can you flat use him as a guy on the outside for most of your snaps? Not really. Franklin, as a collegiate player, has decent size, but was used primarily on the inside where he did the majority of his work. Now, that's a Peyton thing. He's going to be happy with that. He's happy that Nix has that kind of rapport with him. But if they don't re-sign Courtland Sutton, how comfortable are you with going realistically as your outside receivers? Realistically. Either Reynolds and Franklin or Reynolds and Brandon Johnson. That's what you'd be handing your rookie quarterback.
Well,
you might need to figure out something with Courtland Sutton.
I like the selection of Troy Franklin on the 4th round. If you think, as Dana Brugler of The Athletic does, that he's one of the top 12 receivers who came out for this particular draft and drafted. I don't know how many receivers ended up getting drafted as 35, 36, 37, something like that. I like the fact that they got the kid from Utah in the 7th round. He's not nearly as highly rated as Franklin, but, nice pick on the 7th round. You're telling me they're going to be leaning to some degree on 2 rookies drafted in the 4th and 7th round. I understand that the guy picked on the 4th round has played with Bo Nix, and no one else among the receivers can make that claim, obviously.
Yeah, that's a big advantage for him.
It's just so unsettled and uncertain. And I know there are people out there. I don't talk to as many of those people as you do, Sean, but there are people out there who say, in Bo, we trust. But even more significantly, at least in their minds, in Sean Payton, we trust. Sean Payton is a quarterback whisperer. He is an offensive play-calling genius. We didn't see necessarily much evidence of that last year, but I think fairly or unfairly, and I would say more unfairly than fairly, Russell Wilson took the rap for that.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So now the scapegoat is gone, and we see how creative, how skillful Sean Payton remains as a play caller who was once great, but that was a long time ago when he was considered a great play caller in a way that made more difference than almost anything else. The player is always more important than the coach.
Right.
So Drew Brees, I think, had more to do with New Orleans' offensive success than Sean Payton. They had a special relationship. There's no doubt about that. And the best news about the Bo Nix selection is that even now that same relationship seems to be developing at a rather rapid pace with respect to Bo Nix and his head coach, Sean Payton. That's the best news.
Yeah, it is the
worst
news.
News is you've got to have somebody to throw the ball to. And I don't know that they have, as you have suggested, anyone who is established. And even the player who is, Courtland Sutton, assuming he reports, was probably not one of the best 35 receivers, one of the best 36 receivers in the NFL last year by any reasonable measure.
Unless you count touchdowns, and a lot of people do look at that as some sort of, dividing line.
Well, to me, I don't know that that's been an annual feature of Sutton's game.
No, as a matter of fact, in the last
it sort of jumps out
years,
as an outlier.
4 years, he has a total of 10 touchdowns prior to the last year.
Prior to last year.
Right. In fact, he had 14 career touchdown catches. Career. coming into last year and had 10 last year. So it's fair to probably look at that and say that's anomalous. Now, you can also look at the quarterbacks that have been throwing to Courtland Sutton in that span of time and put some
and a lot of
of
different ones.
Well.
I understand that. But the rapport he had with Wilson seemed to be more solid than the rapport he had with any of Wilson's predecessors who played with Courtland Sutton, with the possible exception of 2019 when Joe Flacco and even Drew Lock
Josh Reynolds
threw the ball to Courtland Sutton, and that was
mm-hmm.
the last really big year that Sutton had, carried with it so much promise, and then he tore up his knee.
Yeah. 1,000-yard season, obviously, back in 2019, 6 touchdowns in that span. Josh Reynolds, in his career, has 19 touchdowns, 5 of them coming last year. That tied a career high, getting those passes from Jared Goff. Reynolds, by the way, going into his 9th season. So for this team, there really isn't a lot behind Sutton. And you can make the argument, and I think it can be fair. I think Sutton is a good receiver. But
he's not Devontae Adams.
Right, you can make the argument that Sutton, that's the funny thing about this whole thing. If you're the Broncos, you can make a legitimate argument that Courtland Sutton is fungible. You can replace him. You can replace him with any wide receiver in those kind of positions that's a good receiver and probably get the same numbers. If Sutton moves on, Josh Reynolds will probably be able to match at least the yardage numbers and maybe get close to the touchdown numbers if everything goes right. At least match his probably career high of 5. That's probably the Broncos' perspective. If you're Courtland Sutton, you're looking at it as, I'm one of the guys that's been through all of this. I was fourth in the league, tied for touchdowns. You absolutely need me. So this is coming to a head at some point, but it's a slow motion train wreck, Sandy, because neither side has any incentive.
Which is kind of what the Broncos have been generally for the last 8 years.
That's a fair point. But neither side has any incentive to give and a lot of incentive to hold their ground. When that happens, usually, but not always, there's a separation and the two go their separate ways. I suspect that's what will eventually happen with Courtland Sutton and the Denver Broncos. As to when, who knows? But we'll probably know a lot more in a couple weeks when mandatory minicamp starts. We are going to take a peek at the Denver Nuggets, who, not in 2 weeks, but in 4, have a major, major day of reckoning from one of their starters. But first, a message from our friends at St. Hardin Law.
Well, we talk about planning a great deal on this program, and some things you just can't plan for. Some very unpleasant things you can never anticipate, such as possibility of a car accident. That can happen. A major injury can happen as a result of a car accident. But if you've been involved in one, you know what you need. You need the best attorney or attorneys around. And those people are represented at Zahner Hardin Law by Kurt Zahner and Mark Hardin, the kinds of lawyers you want and need handling your case. They're 2 of the most elite personal injury lawyers, not only in Colorado, but throughout the country. They won nearly every award imaginable: super lawyers, top 100 national trial lawyers, trial lawyer of the year, $1 million advocates. They've appeared in the Denver Post, on local news outlets, even on Good Morning America, and they handle the most important cases. They work tirelessly to make sure our community is a safe place. Multi-million-dollar verdicts you hear about all the time. The respect of every insurance company, you don't hear about that all the time, but that's what you have at Zahner Hardin Law. You're lucky to have these 2 guys in our own backyard. If you've been involved in an auto accident, reach out to Zahner Hardin today at yourstorywill-be-told.com. That's yourstorywill-be-told.com.
For the Denver Nuggets, obviously a challenging offseason, ending a little earlier than they would have liked to have had it, but they obviously have dealt with it, and now they have to figure out what they will do next. Some of it is in their control. Some of it is not. Joining us now to discuss what is not, at least to start, is our friend Arran Andersen from Fox 31. You can follow him on social at Arran Andersen. And Arran, thank you for joining us. A month from today is the decision date for Kentavious Caldwell-Pope to decide on his player option. He has a player option next for $15.4 million next season, but if he chooses to exercise that option, he will become a free agent. How critical is it for the Nuggets, given their salary cap situation, that KCP stays one way or another?
Well, listen, they're in salary cap purgatory, so you're going to have to somehow rob Peter to pay Paul to make this stuff work. And when it comes to KCP, you're talking about a veteran who has playoff experience, a guy who's an elite defender, a guy whose option is, as you mentioned, $15.4 million on the free agent market right now. He's probably going to fetch over $20 million. And as you look down the road, and certainly as you look at this roster, who might just slide into that position? I know that Christian Brown was a name that we heard kicked around at the Nuggets end of the year press conference. But from what we've seen thus far, I don't know that he's the option. We haven't seen him hit three-point shots at any degree of consistency in the postseason. I believe over the last 2 years combined, he's hovering around 21%. I like him coming off the bench, but I think the bigger problem for the Nuggets when it comes to KCP is if you try to play this game of he opts out and you try to lure him back with a salary, you're going to have to make a corresponding move in that starting lineup, which involves Michael Porter Jr., who, might I point out, is healthy, and albeit coming off a really bad series against the Timberwolves, did shine against the Lakers. And you got to believe that maybe market value for him at this point may not be better. So in my mind, I think KCP is maybe the bigger piece of the puzzle to hang on to because of what he offers this team, both offensively, defensively, and certainly with his experience. I think there needs to be a shakeup move this offseason. You mentioned it's a month away. I think we're going to hear something very soon, and certainly around that NBA draft, that maybe the Nuggets finally do make a move. Maybe they ship Michael Porter Jr. out to try to keep this championship window open, because as we know, when it comes to that starting lineup, one that Josh Kroenke is prone to say is no doubt the best starting lineup in basketball, I think it's just cost prohibitive to keep that five together moving forward. I think there's got to be a big move that comes.
See, here's where what they did this year, and it's easy for us to look back now and say that it was a mistake. Maybe the mistake came in drafting the three players who were selected in the most recent NBA draft: Strother, Tyson, Pickett. But none of them played enough this year for the Nuggets to even contemplate the possibility that one of them could move in to the starting lineup, that a Pickett could move in there, a Strother could move in there. And yes, you'd be losing something defensively in any case, but the fact that none of them, I don't believe, played 300 minutes all year, not one of the three played 300 minutes during the regular season, and obviously none of the three played serious minutes in the playoffs, garbage time, end of game minutes here and there. But there's your problem, because they aren't plausible options. I don't say that Brown is the best option next year as a starter, but if Caldwell-Pope opts out and signs a big deal elsewhere, they may have no choice. I agree with you that I think Malone and Booth would feel that for a max player, Michael Porter hasn't reached those heights often enough to be an untouchable. But at the same time, he gives you something that very few teams in the league have: a 6'10" sharpshooter who showed signs this year of making his offensive game more well-rounded. There's just a list of bad options, right? And you're trying to choose among the least bad option of the bunch.
No, that's a fair point. And it certainly makes you wonder if Malone and Booth were on the same page heading into this season, which was, look, we're not going to be able to retain Bruce Brown. We're going to go with younger players to try to replenish this bench. And we just didn't see that. And as you talked about, Strother is a guy they brought in, a guy who came out of college who certainly could fill it up, had a great outside shot, could slash as well, but his Achilles heel was defense. But we just didn't see enough of him this year to really get a feel one way or another as to whether or not that is part of a game that he could really improve on and be effective. off the bench or playing a larger role per chance as a starter. And it's certainly the guy I think who's intriguing for me is Peyton Watson, because while he didn't play a lot of minutes and certainly didn't see a lot of minutes in that final series against the T-Wolves, there were flashes from him defensively where you thought, you know what, this guy really
he's fine defensively. There's no force. Defense.
But it's like you just wish you could meld some of these guys together, because they have intangibles that are good, but they don't have the complete package. And until we see that, I just don't know what options the Nuggets really have. And, talk about Michael Porter Jr., we have spoken about potential with him for a long time. And he has shot the ball well on occasion. But it just seems to me, as we even go back to the final series against the Heat, when this team needed him to perform, there were times where you look around and he's nowhere to be found. And, my hunch is you really look at this big picture, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, while he is 31 years old,
yes,
I feel like he is a guy that you can count on night out, whereas with MPJ, he's a guy that has a tendency to disappear, and we've seen a lot more of that than I think nights where you come away going, gosh, that guy really made a big impact in winning a basketball game.
Caldwell-Pope's numbers are interesting. For someone who makes the money that he makes, is looking at that $15 million option, and I agree with you. We saw what Bruce Brown got. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is worth more than that on the market. But you're talking about a guy that averaged 10.1 points per game, 2.4 rebounds, and 2.4 assists per game. And those numbers don't jump off the screen at you. The shooting percentage from three, though, 40.6% does. And the fact that Caldwell-Pope is not only the best defender the Nuggets have, but he's the best defender they have and never needs the ball, which makes things very, very efficient and effective. It's hard to look at the way the Nuggets operate offensively or defensively with that starting five and look at it in any way, take the stats out of it just with your eyes and say that Caldwell-Pope's not a critical piece of the puzzle. And I agree with you, perhaps even more so than Michael Porter Jr., who has an offensive game that is the envy of a lot of players in the league, but he doesn't do all the same things. Caldwell-Pope, to me, is the guy that unlocks everybody else besides Nikola Jokic.
Yeah. Well, it's the intangibles he brings, right? Where there were nights that MPJ, that the shot wasn't falling, and you say, oh my gosh, he had 8 rebounds. Well, I come from a world where that's expected,
You're
right?
16, right?
It shouldn't just happen on an off night. That should be your contribution every night. And KCP's a guy who brings his lunch pail. He's going to give it his all on both ends of the court, and he operates within the flow of the game. And unfortunately, as you look at this free agent market this year, there are not a lot of big names. He's a guy who has rings with 2 different teams, a guy who has that intangible, that leadership component where he can function as a role player, as you said, doesn't need the basketball to be happy. He's happy buying into the process of winning games. And if you're a team like the Sixers who feel like, well, we've got Embiid, we need some guys that need to help lead this team, to show them the way to get it done. He's one of those guys that has the intangibles to do it. And I think that's why on this free agent market, he's really going to command a high salary, maybe middle 20s. We saw Bruce Brown get 22 last year for a guy who was coming off the bench. I think when you look at a starter like KCP, he's going to fetch a pretty penny. And I think there's going to be a team out there that's going to open up their checkbook because they realize that he brings a lot more than just, guarding the perimeter or knocking down shots. He's got a winning gene, and he's going to be a guy who certainly could help a team like that, who may be on the fence, going to help them get over the hump.
Well, we're looking at a situation in which the Nuggets do have one thing in their pocket. They do hold KCP's bird rights, which means they can exceed the salary cap in order to sign him. That in of itself, I guess, is good. But at a certain point, you brought up Arran robbing Peter to pay Paul. There's only so many times, and let's even bypass the idea that signing him to $20 million plus a year launches them into the second apron of the cap and basically makes them unable to improve the roster almost any further. Really, you lose mid-level exception. You lose the ability to trade some of your draft picks down the road. It really hampers you when you jump into that second apron. But they can exceed the cap to sign him because they have the bird rights. My guess is,
and they didn't with Brown.
Right. They did not have his bird rights, so they probably would have gone that way. But my guess is KCP at this stage, because of the points you mentioned, will opt out and will become a free agent. I suspect he'll give the Nuggets the first opportunity to make a deal that's palatable. The question is, at what point for the Nuggets, even as much as they want him back, does that number become too big to swallow?
Well, it's too big to swallow because you're not going to be able to improve this roster. And as it stands right now, you're not going to keep up, as we saw with the Timberwolves. Dallas has certainly gotten better. We know Oklahoma City is a force to be reckoned with. And, oh, by the way, there's a team in San Antonio with the rookie of the year who's going to make great strides as well. I mean, keeping up with the Joneses is really going to be an issue. And as it stands right now, this team needs a big man. And there's a name, Andre Drummond is a name that gets kicked around. You're going to have to find guys who are willing to come on board for the veteran minimum. And while I think it's attractive to say, geez, let's just open up the checkbook and keep KCP, let's keep this starting five together. We saw the dividends, what that means when you don't have a bench, right, in the postseason. You're going to have to tax this starting lineup throughout the regular season. By the time they get to the playoffs, they're toast. They don't have anything left in the tank, and there's no one coming off the bench. There's no cavalry. And we're going to run into the Nuggets are going to run into the same situation that we saw this month, which is they ran into a fresh, young team that came at you in waves, and you're just not going to be able to compete on that level. So it's going to be a quandary. We got 4 weeks until this unfolds. But, yeah, I don't know. As I said, you've got to rob Peter to pay Paul, but boy, you open up that wallet to pay KCP, and that means there's going to be less monies to spread around to replenish, positions on this roster, and certainly the bench, which are going to really come into fold next season when it comes to playoff time. And as we saw this year, this team was just not ready to move on after round 2 because they were just flat out gassed.
Well, let's explore the reasons for that, because you've touched on these points already along the way in this conversation. There are 3 remaining teams in the NBA playoffs. All of them have shot blockers that the Nuggets don't have. All of them take and make 3-pointers more often than Denver does. Denver was last in 3-point attempts. That's not the direction the game is going. Boston shoots more threes and makes more than anybody else. Minnesota and Dallas, as we've seen in this series through 4 games, can take and make threes. They all have shot blockers. The Nuggets don't take and make threes, and they don't have a shot blocker. That's a problem.
Yeah, a huge problem. And as much as I like Jordan coming off the bench to spell Nikola Jokic, he's in the latter stages of his career. So that there's got to be an emphasis to find that guy to back Jokic up, a guy who can certainly protect the rim. And when it comes to knocking down 3-point shots, Sandy, I don't know how many times during the course of Game 7, Game 6, during those brutal losses, Game 2 to the Timberwolves, I was screaming at the TV, you don't need to throw up a 3-point shot. I think that was one of the problems I had with that postseason series against Minnesota, was that the Nuggets got lulled into this game of settling as opposed to dictating.
Well, I think fatigue played a part in that too, don't you think?
Very likely the case. But yeah, I don't have a problem with them not being among league leaders in 3-point shots.
No, but you don't want to.
I have a problem in some of the players, Sandy, not being able to knock down shots when they were open. And frankly, as you look at the bench, I just don't know who that guy was going to be. Who's going to come off the bench and knock down a big shot like that.
And one of the interesting points we talk about needing a backup big man, I've harped on this for, quite frankly, years at this point, is that the one thing that on any viewpoint that Calvin Booth and Michael Malone seem to be on the same page on is the fact that a backup big man is extraneous and unnecessary.
Certainly, Malone's been quoted as saying
so.
Shot blocker is a luxury.
And Booth hasn't signed anybody or made any moves to get anybody of that ilk. They don't seem, the Nuggets organization does not seem to see the same value in it that the 3 of us do.
Well, maybe they can go out and get Bol again. That didn't seem to work out either. With that was the guy that, as we look back, that was the guy that entertained the fan base because he was so big and could knock down shots in summer league play, but certainly didn't find a way to fit into this roster. I don't know that. I'm not sure why that wouldn't be a priority based on the fact that you've got other teams within the Western Conference who have such formidable front lines, where why would you not want to bring somebody in who would function in that capacity? Certainly, we've seen the Timberwolves reap the dividends of Rudy Gobert, a guy who certainly has shown brightly on the defensive end, winning 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards. I'm curious to see who might be available. But again, as we look at the salary cap and the fact that this franchise is so hamstrung in terms of monies available, I just don't know who might be out there who would fit that bill to come in and help in that regard.
It will be a fascinating offseason for the Nuggets. Of course, make sure you give Arran a follow on social at Arran Andersen. Catch him on Fox 31 and host of the Colorado Sports Night program as well on Channel 2. So give those a peek too. Arran, always good to talk to you. Appreciate the insight because, for the Nuggets, it feels like the league very quickly caught up and maybe passed them in a couple ways. And now the Nuggets have to adjust and they don't have the money to do it. It will be a very, very fascinating offseason. Thanks for all the input.
Indeed. Great chatting with you guys. And more importantly, great to see you. Nicely done, my friends.
Yeah, thanks. It's you can find out about all those faces for radio. But Arran TV face, as you can see there. Always nice to have Arran on. Appreciate it. The situation with the Nuggets, obviously, is a slightly more difficult one than the situation with the Avalanche. But the Avalanche find themselves exiting the playoffs at the same time. They're looking at the 4 teams remaining and what are they looking for that those 4 teams that are playing still have. Is it just luck? We'll talk about that because, look, luck factors in a little bit when you're talking about online sports betting. And for over 4 years now, you've heard the ads, you've seen them, you've been overwhelmed by them. They're everywhere. You can probably even recite some of them in your sleep. So we're going to add one more to the pile. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but believe me, you'll appreciate this one. Mile High Sports has gathered all of the best sign-up bonuses and offers and put them on one page on our website. So it's easy for you to go check out all of the offers available to you, and you pick the one that makes the most sense for you. We wanted to make it easy for folks interested in betting to find those best options. So we did all the research, brought them all together in a way that makes it simple to know what's available, whether that's bonus bets, second chance bets, deposit matches, everything, all there in between, all in one place, all of the opportunities for you to jump into that world with the best bargain that you can get and that fits your particular style. So visit milehighsports.com today or download our mobile app and then click on Colorado Sports Betting. Easy enough. It's just that simple. You'll get everything you need to know all in one place. Think of it as your bonus for your friends at Mile High Sports. Sandy, the Colorado Avalanche now are looking for some answers. And obviously there are fewer financial difficulties than there are for the Nuggets, but with the health of Gabriel Landeskog, with the suspension of Valeri Nichushkin, there's about $13 million sitting in limbo for the Avalanche, that at any point in time, either or both of those guys get activated next season, and their money immediately has to hit the cap. The Avalanche have roughly $9 million under the cap right now, but that's not counting Landeskog on LTIR and Nichushkin suspended.
Well, we're projecting on what the cap might be.
Right. And it's a rough projection.
It's a rough projection. And I think the biggest issue right now would be the Nichushkin activation, because you know that as soon as Landeskog and the doctors are comfortable, he'll be activated.
Yes. And the Avs are perfectly comfortable with that $7 million
that the Avs are obligated to activate Nichushkin. Paying him, well, at the postseason press conference, I thought it was very interesting that Chris McFarland, the general manager, said, unprompted, I know you're going to ask me about contract termination.
Obviously.
Nobody had and nobody was going to, actually. Came at the end of the press conference. I know you're going to ask me about something that for the better part of half an hour you haven't asked me about.
But it's kind of important to me, and I want to get ahead of it.
But
right.
Here's what he said. And it's true, we can't terminate him currently. They have to pay him even if they don't activate him. But if they don't activate him, he doesn't count against the cap. They can pay him, and they can take a crack at terminating the deal in conjunction, I imagine, with the NHL, who will make the decision through the people running this program as to whether he's eligible to be reinstated. All that's open-ended. It's at least 6 months. It's not 6 months maximum. It's 6 months minimum. I was fascinated to read in the Post the other day, the back and forth that they have once a week, generally on Sundays. And our friends Sean Keeler and Troy Rank were the participants this week, and both agreed that the Nuggets were in a better situation than the Avalanche were in. And I have great affection and respect for both, and I disagree with both.
Yeah,
on that.
I do too.
I disagree with both. People say the Avalanche don't have any leverage here, any control here. Well, yeah, they do. And the way Landeskog talked, Landeskog wants to play again, but he's not going to play, and he won't be cleared to play 1 second before he's as sure as he's ever going to be. I went back, given his passing the other day, and watched some stuff on Bill Walton earlier this week. And Walton said the biggest mistake in hindsight, once his career was over, looking back on his entire career, said the biggest mistake I ever made was coming back and trying to play when I shouldn't have in Portland. I didn't have the character to say no. Well, that was the late 70s. We're talking about 45 years later, and everybody is more sophisticated. Walton had injuries that pretty much were unique to him. The bone structure in his foot, the 6'11" frame, all of the rest. Landeskog's injury is also unusual, but you don't see Landeskog saying, as an athlete of his caliber might have said 45 years ago, gee, I can't sit out 2 years. My career would be threatened. Walton, because he came back when he shouldn't have, by his own admission.
This was, by the way, a guy who was the overall number one pick in the draft in the MVP.
He ended up missing at least 3 more full seasons after that, and 4 if you count 78, 79 as part of that consideration when he was playing in the playoffs and cracked a bone in the foot, split it. And I'm just saying, he won't come back too soon. And I don't think Nichushkin will come back at all. So I actually think their issues are less pressing. And we'll get into what they might do with respect to free agency. And I think we all agree they have to be on the hunt for the next Jonathan Drouin, himself a free agent. I believe the Avalanche will choose to keep.
Yes. You look over at the conference finals. Obviously, last night in an overtime game, the Panthers knocked off the Rangers 3-2 to tie that series at 2-2. I think the Panthers have been the better team in that series.
And could easily be ahead 3-1.
But they don't have the better goalie, because I don't know if anybody
and that matters in the playoffs,
has a better goalie than Igor Shesterkin
he's
of
the best.
The Rangers.
And Bobrovsky might be the second best goaltender in hockey. Apologies to Ottinger, who's been great in the playoffs.
Well, last night they were the second and third stars, respectively.
Well, as well they should have been.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, Shesterkin was under a lot more pressure last night than Bobrovsky. It was just like the previous game. The Rangers stole that one in overtime. And last night, Florida came back and won in overtime and deserved to win. And the series should be 2-2, as it is. I don't think home ice is a big deal. Florida split at home. The Rangers split at home. And Game 5 will be at Madison Square Garden. And I think, actually, it's at least as competitive a series as the one out west.
Right. Also 2-2.
I think all these teams now, with the exception of Edmonton, that's a team more built along the lines that the Avalanche are built on. They have the 3 best goaltenders in the sport, if not in the world.
Shesterkin, by the way, in the postseason, 10-4 with a 2.38 goals against and a 925 save percentage in the postseason. Yikes. And lest you think that's out of the ordinary, last year, even though they didn't go as far in the 7 games, he had a 1.96 and a 931. So you know you have an elite guy. We've seen Ottinger, of course, through the eyes of the Avalanche. You talk about Bobrovsky. When we broke down the Avs season, the idea that Alexander Georgiev was maybe going to be one of the problems turned out not to be the case. It wasn't the first game against Winnipeg. He wasn't the reason the Avs got knocked out. But is he good enough, given the rest of the Avs roster, to go ahead and run this back. I think he is, because I don't look at the Avs offense as being dramatically less impactful than Edmonton's. And I think, quite frankly, that Georgiev is better than Skinner in that. For
Remember
the
Yankees had their core four
Mhm.
back in the day when they were a dynasty, late 90s, early 2000s. All right. The Avs have their core four. We all know who they are. McKinnon, McCarr, Rantanen, Taves. That's the Avalanche core four. The Avalanche,
Apologies
right now,
to Lehkonen there, but yes.
I don't think Lehkonen's a hell of a player defensively.
Mhm.
Defensively, but he's not in the class with those four.
I think
guys.
it's like core 3.5, but I'm with you. I think it Taves and Lehkonen, and I think as soon as next year Middlestat, who
I'm not saying they were all great this year. I think McKinnon was great,
but Taves is a top pair guy,
especially during
25
the
other
season.
teams in the league.
Yeah, I mean, to me, he's a core guy. He's won a Stanley Cup here. He was a major factor in their winning that Stanley Cup. McCarr might be the best defenseman in the world year in and year out, if not in any particular year like this one. I don't think he's the best defenseman in the world this year.
He might have been the second,
second, maybe third. A lot of great defensemen right now in the NHL. But my point is that when you look at those four and you throw in, forget about Lehkonen, he's terrific. You can just plug him in and hope he stays healthy.
Right.
He's undergoing has undergone shoulder surgery, may or may not be ready for training camp in September. But I think the Casey Middlestat trade is fascinating because of its promise. You got a young player in Middlestat, 25 years old, restricted free agent. They're obviously going to bring him back. 9 points in 11 games in the playoffs.
He clearly performed already.
And was slumping at the end of the regular season, but took off during the playoffs. And I think he was a positive when it came to actual / expected goal share in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. He's a positive guy,
right?
In that respect. In fact, you were pointing out some numbers that suggested that he was among the better Avalanche in that regard. Talk about a core four. Now, I don't know that he'd belong in it, but in the playoffs, you could argue in certain areas, like expected goal share, he ranked maybe even inside the top four for the Avalanche. The Avalanche issue is re-signing, I think, a Trennan, re-signing Drouin, probably not re-signing Sean Walker.
I agree.
And so promoting a Malinsky or Caleb Jones.
Caleb Jones, by the way, a free agent himself.
Right. So I think that's where they have to fill in. I would bring Trennan back.
I would too.
But maybe you find this year's version of Drouin, bring him in at around $1 million a year.
That's what they're going to have to
find. Kind of deal that Hainan, the former DU star, was on in Boston. Frankly, Patrick Kane, who's 35 years old, I understand, but was a point-a-game guy once he hooked up with the Red Wings.
Yeah, and of course the Avalanche were at least in on that, kicking the tires, and it didn't go that way. We'll find out what they do in the offseason. Stars and Oilers, by the way, tonight, tied 2-2 in Edmonton, as obviously Canada's last chance. The Connor McDavids of the world keep going. We'll see a little bit about how that goes as well. Want to talk about the Colorado Rockies. They have been playing better, a lot better than you might think, but definitely not last night. But first, as they used to say, a word from our sponsors.
Yes, absolutely. And we talk about GB Fish and Chips quite often here on this program. And you probably heard of them. You know who they are. Their signature ads have been airing for years around here. And, of course, they're locally owned and operated. GB Fish and Chips has the best drinks, meat pies, fish and chips this side of the pond. But they cater in addition to all of that. And that means for this time of year, they're the ideal type of outfit to deal with, because you've got summer block parties starting. You've got graduation parties that are starting, already have taken place. Give your friends and family a unique fry-on-site experience. And the best part of catering, of course, you don't have to do anything. GB Fish and Chips does all the work. Stop by any of their 4 metro locations or visit gbfishandchips.com and bring authentic fish and chips to your next gathering. That's gbfishandchips.com.
The Colorado Rockies last night were absolutely crushed by the Cleveland Guardians. Cleveland wins 13-7 as Josh Naylor hits 2 home runs. David Fry hits a home run. Jose Ramirez hits a home run. Scored 4 times.
Among other things he did.
Yeah, 4 times. He now leads the majors with 56 ribbies, including 32 this
Just
month.
think about that, because we're roughly at the 1/3 mark.
Yeah.
56 times 3.
Do you know how many games they've played?
Gets you into
Cleveland's played 55 games.
The area of
Hack
the
Wilson.
all-time Hack Wilson territory, the all-time record for RBIs in a single season. He's on a pace to threaten that record.
He has more than we talk about a point a game guy in hockey. He's got an RBI game guy.
Yeah.
In baseball, and that is just stunning. So, I mean, obviously, they mashed, and that's kind of what Cleveland does. They're obviously second in the major leagues with 282 runs. That they mashed the ball, but the Rockies weren't really expected, I think, to compete regularly with a team like Cleveland. And here they are. They win the first one of the series, and then they come back and they get thumped in this one. And you get it. That happens. They're not a good baseball team. At the same time, they have been playing relatively good baseball for a while. Peter Lambert takes the loss last night. But the Rockies, for the most part, going into this homestand, 6 games against Philadelphia, in which they won the series 2-1. Here they are with 1-1 in Cleveland. They finish the series tonight. This will be the end of the homestand. If you were to say that they had a chance 5 games in to finish this 6-game homestand 3-3, I think any Rockies fan would take it against the teams that not only lead each of their respective leagues, but are 2 of the biggest and most explosive scoring offenses in the game.
Well, they're the first and second best teams as we speak in all of baseball.
And the Rockies have played them at 500. Give them some credit.
Well, yeah.
They're 3-2.
3-2.
At worst case, they'll finish 500.
So the worst case scenario is 500.
Win.
And then they get a break. They go and play the Dodgers.
Yeah, no problem. You get the Dodgers in
Angeles,
LA. That'll do.
Chavez Ravine.
Great.
But I think, I think we were talking about this a little bit, how the starting pitching all of a sudden has gotten better. And I believe our friend Thomas Harding at MLB.com had this number, and it was a number that he came up with earlier in the week before the series opener with Cleveland. 13 quality starts in the last 23 games, the Rocky starting staff. 3.77 earned run average. Now, we know that they have the worst ERA in baseball as a team, and are fixing to go 3 straight years with that dubious designation belonging to them and only them.
They are the only team in baseball with a team ERA over 5.32. Right. Next worst is the abysmal Chicago White Sox at 4.7.
The starting pitching, apart from last night, and wasn't necessarily great the other night, but they won a high-scoring game to open the series.
Right.
But 3.77 over a stretch of 23 games shows you that, at least when it comes to Quantrill and Gomber, they have makings of a decent rotation, if not a particularly good one.
No.
And they are swinging the bats. I mean, they did score 7 runs last night, and they scored 8 runs in the opener. And they scored pretty well against Philadelphia in winning 2 games.
And the only game in which they didn't score in this homestand, they scored 7 last night. They scored 8 in the win prior to that, 5 in the win prior to that, 4 in the loss to Philly, the only loss in that series. And the only time they scored fewer than 4, they still won that game.
They still won that game without
innings.
Blackman and McMahon basically in the lineup. McMahon came in late as a defensive replacement, but as you say, I saw that game. Cleanly played game, not a lot of hitting. Very good starting pitching on both sides. Pretty good bullpen work. Sensational by the Rockies. Pretty good for Philadelphia in that particular game. But It doesn't change the general picture. The Rockies are on pace to lose 105 games. They are exactly now at the 1/3 mark with a record of 19-35. Okay, triple 19, and what do you get? You get 57.
Right.
And 57 out of 162 figures out to a record of 57 and 105. That would be the worst Rockies season ever, even worse than last year. However, there are some promising signs. And I think the one true untouchable on the Rockies roster right now in their lineup has emerged. A young guy who under no circumstances they can trade. And that would be Ezekiel Tovar.
Tovar now takes over the lead in wins above replacement from Ryan McMahon, who's having an all-star caliber season. When you look at all shortstops across the major leagues, the only guys that have a higher wins above replacement, you probably know their name, Mookie Betts, hotshot youngster Gunnar Henderson from Baltimore,
yeah.
Bobby Witt Jr., former second wave hotshot youngster, Anthony Volpe of the Yankees. You're getting a pattern, right? Ellie De La Cruz of the Reds.
Who's one of the most exciting players in baseball.
And
to
Tovar.
watch. And Tovar is an exciting player to watch.
I mean, youth is served. I mean, obviously, Mookie Betts, moving to the infield this year, and he's been tremendous, the best in baseball when you're talking about that category. But Henderson, Witt, Volpe, De La Cruz, and Tovar.
That's pretty good company.
That's the group. And that's impressive stuff when you're talking about that young core. And it feels like Tovar, in this case, who has 9 walks and 224 at-bats, still has room to grow.
Oh, I think so. I mean, he certainly can become more selective, but game I saw,
hard to be less selective.
He was not
9 walks to 73 strikeouts.
Yeah. But I think of late he's been making contact with a little more consistency, and when he makes contact, he's dangerous. The batting average is more than respectable at 286, slugging 464, and an OPS of 782 and a 1.9 WAR mark. He's the best player they've got.
And it's a good sign that it's the best player when he's one of your young guys. That helps.
As an all-around player, he's the best they've got. And, Diaz is an older catcher, but is producing. Doyle, Rogers, and Blackman have been okay. Blackman's on fire lately.
Bad start.
Coming back into the lineup. The Rockies have 6 guys who are basically core guys who could probably play a fairly regular role for most teams, not all teams, but most teams in Major League Baseball.
That's fair.
And apart from Tovar, you got McMahon, you got Diaz, you got Doyle, you got Rogers, you got Blackman. And the only problem is that Diaz is in his 30s. Blackman is well into his 30s. Doyle and Rogers are younger players, but they've been around for a while. Same thing with McMahon. And the guy, apart from Tovar, who's untouchable, you could probably get the most for, maybe
McMahon.
Strike the word probably, is Ryan McMahon.
Absolutely. That's the guy you would be able to get the most for. And we'll talk a little bit about where the Rockies might need to go with that. But you look at the other parts of the quote unquote core, or the young guys, this is the risk of having a bunch of young guys all at once, right? Michael Toglia, considered one of their top prospects, and kind of seems to be stuck being what they used to call a 4A player. A little too good for the minors, having trouble to stick at the major league level. Toglia in his 15 games, minus 0.5 in wins above replacement. Nolan Jones in the 26 games, currently hurt, had a bit of a setback of late in Albuquerque as well, minus 0.6. Jordan Beck in his 23 games, definitely rushed the majors before breaking his hand, minus 0.7. And of course, the $182 million man, Chris Bryant, when he has played in the 21 games, minus 0.4. The idea behind that statistic is if you were to grab the major league average player, just the average player, whatever that would be.
0.0.
If you could, the hypothetical average major league player, that player would, when you'd have an 81 team, and everyone would have just done their job, nothing special,
Right.
nothing bad, zeros. So when you're below that, what that means is average major league player X has been better than you.
And in effect, you are either a 4A or AAA player,
or in
by
theory,
virtue of your performance.
seems to be, maybe would even belong at that point in the minors. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen for a lot of these guys that Jones and Bryant specifically are parts of. The Rockies, very, very important part of their program going forward. But yeah, it's good to see Tovar play the way he's playing. It really is, and it's impressive to see. Quite frankly, Doyle, who I did not expect to be particularly impactful offensively, he has gotten quite a bit better at driving blocks. He's already got 15 steals. The Rockies as a team have 31. The one guy that Bud Black seems to be willing to let him go is Doyle, and he's also got 5 home runs on the season as well. So Doyle finds himself, he's not going to be a 2020 guy, barring some sort of massive run, but is he going to be potentially a 15 and 40 guy? Yeah, quite possibly, while playing Gold Glove caliber defense in center field, and has a great arm for center field as well.
Sure.
That's a building block. It's, again, is he the centerpiece of the organization? No, but is he?
And Rogers, I put him in the same category with Rogers. That's
even on good teams. Brendan Doyle would be a 4th outfielder.
Yes,
and Brendan Rodgers would probably be a utility infielder, even on championship caliber teams. The Rockies clearly are a mile away from that, but there are some things that are good. They're trending in the right direction. They've won 11 out of their last 18, 11 and 7 of their last 18, which doesn't sound like much until you realize they've only won 19 games all year. So things really have seemed to change as it's heated up downtown in Coors Field. The team has seemed to play better, as Cal Quantrill said after his last outing. We are capable of playing good baseball when we focus on playing good baseball. And sometimes when you're a team like the Rockies, the back to the basics approach, just do your job. Make sure you're doing it every day in the best way possible, and don't try to do too much. Sometimes that's the best way to go for a team that's so full of young players.
Well, it's the way to avoid the kind of humiliating season that is usually associated for teams that lose between 110 and 115 games. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody, save from maybe the White Sox, is going to make a run at 120 losses this year. The White Sox are at 15 and 41. If they lose 4 more games before they win the next one, they'll be right on pace, as the Rockies were for a while this year, to match or maybe exceed in futility the 1962 New York Mets. But
they seem to be moving beyond that.
I think the Rockies now, they're a last place team in a division that's decent, but not as strong
as anyone expected
it's supposed to be.
Right.
And that was true last year too. The Dodgers, who by their standards at 35 and 22 aren't exactly ripping through their schedule through a little bit more than a third of the season. They're 5.5 up on the Giants and Padres right now, 8.5 ahead of Arizona, 14.5 ahead of the Rockies. And that's without tearing it up. In fact, there are only 2 teams in the National League, the Dodgers and the Phillies, who are playing better than 600 baseball at the moment. The strength in Major League Baseball, and this is also a break for the Rockies and maybe even for the Marlins too, the American League is quite a bit stronger than the National League.
It certainly looks like it this year. Ty Block will take the hill for the Rockies tonight, 6:40 p.m. start down at Coors Field for the finale and the rubber match of the series against Cleveland. They'll be off tomorrow before heading, as Sandy mentioned, to Los Angeles to take on the Dodgers. Quantrill expected to pitch in that series. Austin Gomber skipped in the rotation, with Soreness expected at this point to pitch on Sunday.
You know what makes me nervous about that? Garrett Whitlock of the Boston Red Sox had some elbow soreness recently, and when they finally examined the elbow, they determined that he'd have to have surgery and would miss the rest of the year. Elbow soreness often leads to elbow surgery.
The Rockies don't have German Marquez. They don't have Antonio Senzatella. Right now, they don't have Kyle Freeland. They can hardly afford to lose Gomber. So be a little white knuckle until they find out if he could start this weekend. Want to remind you, with warmer weather here, it's time to get outside and have some fun with your family and friends. And sure, you love entertaining at the home, but sometimes you need a break from the kitchen. It's hard to entertain when you're not doing any of the fun stuff. And that's when you need our friends at Rolling Smoke Barbecue. Whether you're having a half dozen folks, you're just grabbing something for the family that's quick and easy and tasty, or you're throwing a big old party of 50 or more, you can pick up the best barbecue in town from one of Rolling Smoke's 4 easy-to-find locations. The OG there, Aurora at the Stanley Marketplace, and then in Golden at the Golden Mill, at the corner of Dry Creek and University in Centennial. That's the one that I will frequent. If you see me there, say hi. And now the newest location open at 38th Avenue in Wheat Ridge. And if you're headed to a show up at Red Rocks and you're craving a little barbecue, why wouldn't you? You can find them too. The food is delicious. It's first rate, consistent across the board. You want to make sure if you're going to order online, do it early, because you know what? Some of that stuff, when they make it, it's gone. So you want to jump in on some of the smoked turkey or the honey bourbon sausage. You better get going on it quickly, because it does not last. So give them a look online. You can order there as well. Rolling Smoke Barbecue online at rollingsmokebbq.com. Sandy, this morning, Major League Baseball history changes, and in many ways long overdue. Today, for baseball, after a long amount of trying to figure out how to make it all fit and how to make it all make sense, the major leagues have integrated the statistics from the fortunately defunct Negro leagues into the Major League Baseball archive and now history.
And that would span 1920 through 1948.
1920 through 1948, about 72% of the statistics are being used. They will continue to do the research and try to fill in the gaps as they go. But this was enough to go.
And I understand it's been a long time in developing these statistics, and there's still more work to be done as they try to uncover more box scores. And it is a tremendous endeavor, I think.
But at the same time, you know what? Good for baseball to just
you know
go with it.
You know what spurred it on? And I know this because I was in Birmingham about a year and a half ago for a football game, but spent a lot of time at Rickwood Field, which was the home not only of the Birmingham Barons, but the Birmingham Black Barons, who in 1948 had as their center fielder perhaps the greatest player in the history of baseball, a fellow named Willie Mays.
Mm-hmm.
And though there are no recorded box scores of Willie Mays homering, if there had been, his lifetime total of 660 would increase.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they'll come up with some evidence of a home run, or a few home runs anyway, that Willie Mays hit. Willie Mays in 1948 was a better player than he was in 1971, 72, 73 at the end of his career.
Right.
He was a better player even as a teenager. He was, especially defensively, he was a marvel. And I've seen the vast expanse of center fielder must cover at Rickwood Field, but they're playing major league games now on an annual basis in Rickwood Field, games that count in the standings. And that is the home, to me, of Negro League Baseball. That ballpark is the home with so much of the history of Negro League Baseball. They have a museum there, and of course there's the one in Kansas City that I've had the good fortune to visit on multiple occasions, and it is worth going back every time I'm in that area. I make it a point to go back, and I think the folks at that museum have spurred these efforts on Kansas City, obviously a very famous Negro League baseball town, and a very, very good baseball town.
There's been
whatever someone might tell you to the contrary,
for and for obvious reasons, and the momentum is continuing to grow. Even the sport's biggest licensed video game, MLB The Show, long running program there. There's special features that this year and a little bit of last year has been going through the historical careers of great Negro League players, Oscar Charlton, Turkey Stearns, players like that maybe folks haven't had a chance to learn about. It's interesting because it alters the way that the record books are, and a couple of really, really big ones. The first one, probably that people have had in their head forever, the career leader in batting average over the course of a very long time has been Ty Cobb at 367. He is no longer the man on top. Josh Gibson, the catcher for the Homestead Grays, power hitting backstop there. Now, is the major's career leader with a 372 batting average. He also gets the single season batting average, taking it away from going back there as Gibson, now 466 in 1943,
Right.
ends up with the top one. And then Gibson also becomes the career leader in slugging percentage and OPS, moving ahead in both categories of one Babe Ruth. And I imagine there will be some people. Baseball is filled, obviously, with a lot of people that both appreciate and love the history and like things to stay exactly where they were. But the argument that I've had forever, and I think it's a very salient point that I certainly haven't come up to it. These happened long before I was born. But the idea in why would these be major league records? Well, why would they not be? The players that were in the major leagues when they were segregated didn't have to play against that talent, and vice versa. So there is no reason,
except when they were barnstorming,
right?
And you'd get a feel, to the extent that there's history on that it was get equal. A feel that the white players viewed the black players professionally, if not personally, as equals.
And so this is absolutely
very much
the right move. And you don't even have to take my word for it. We talked about Ty Cobb's long-held record for the greatest career batting average, and that's obviously one of sort of the crown jewels of baseball history. And now it goes to Josh Gibson.
Well, one other point, though,
mm-hmm.
along the lines that you're arguing. Sure, Josh Gibson never hit a home run off a white pitcher. Babe Ruth never hit a home run off a black pitcher.
Yeah.
Although Babe Ruth did play against black pitchers, but they were barnstorming tours.
Right.
They were exhibitions.
And Ruth and Garrick barnstormed a lot during that time as well.
Absolutely, they did, and made quite a bit of money. And I'm sure the black players were compensated, but perhaps not as well.
Some of that used to happen in Denver as well. At what used to be Merchants Park, it's no longer there. There's still plaque that shows where it was, but some of those barnstorming Babe Ruth and some of the players in the Negro League came through Denver at that span.
I would recommend reading Joe Posnanski's book, which involves the top 100 players, in Joe's opinion, in the history of Major League Baseball. He writes long chapters. This all is material that's appeared in The Athletic, but now it's out in book form, and I have it, and I browse through it. And yes, Josh Gibson is in there and highly ranked. And yes, Oscar Charleston is in there and highly ranked. Buck Leonard is in there and highly ranked. Right up there with the Williams and the Speakers and the Rogers Hornsbys and the Ty Cobbs. You can't separate them out. Ted Williams played on the team that happened to be, although Ted Williams was a great champion for integration and said so in his Hall of Fame speech in 1966, but Ted Williams played on the Boston Red Sox team that was the last team to integrate. Not until 1959, when Ted Williams was at the end of his career. And the American League, safe to say, slower to integrate than the National League, generally speaking. So Ted Williams did not hit against black pitching to the extent that other great stars did. I still think batting average isn't everything. Even OPS isn't everything about a ball player.
No.
And I don't think it hurts the standing, relatively speaking, of any of the white players, but it makes real baseball fans go back and look up and read about these great Negro League stars that never had a chance to play in a major league.
This isn't new for baseball, by the way. Back in 1969, 6 other what they called major leagues were incorporated into this, what became the Major League database. The National League, the American League, of course, the American Association, which ran from 1882 to 1891, the Union Association of 1884, the Players League in 1890, which was started by renegade players from the American and National, the Federal League in 1914 and 1915 were all rolled into this. So this isn't the first time baseball has done this. In fact, they did this back in 1969 when they tried to find an opportunity to look at these other major leagues and give them credit. John Thorne, who's the official historian for the major leagues, this all started in 2020 to get this done today. 17-person committee included many of the Negro League experts and statisticians still available. And they brought up that the pandemic year of 2020, when the season was only 60 games, made them realize, wait, a shortened season still functions within all of our data if you put it the same way. So the rules are the same. You still have to have the 3.1 plate appearances per game in order to qualify. Some of those things are really, really fascinating. And if you think that it's different to change. I understand when change happens, people are still frustrated. Pluto isn't a planet, and okay, Ty Cobb doesn't have the batting average record anymore. But you know who doesn't care about it? Ty Cobb's great grandson. Here's what Tyrus Cobb said about this. Baseball history is a part of U.S. history, and I think the major leagues acknowledging and incorporating the Negro Leagues is a huge step in bringing all the parts of baseball history together. And I think it's actually pretty exciting that there's a new statistical batting average leader. I made sure to look him up, meaning Gibson, and Oscar Charleston, and some of the other guys who finished at the top of the list. I think it's a really exciting thing for baseball history. So if Ty Cobb's great-grandson
is okay with it,
it's not only okay with it, as he said, it's exciting.
It's part of history.
It's a good thing. Then it's a good thing. There's no one to offend here. This is the right thing to do. And there's no one that's wronged by it. So it's great that baseball brings this.
No, they haven't lowered Ty Cobb's average.
No.
Last time I looked, it's still 367.
Still 367. Just doesn't happen to be the highest in a career.
And anybody who ever saw Josh Gibson will tell you that the matchups between Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige were as good as any batter pitching matchup in the history of the game.
28 more wins added to his total to get him to 125. And by the way, there is something fitting.
And Satchel Paige got a chance to pitch in the major leagues, but well past what would have been considered his prime, although we were never exactly sure how old Satchel Paige really was.
He made sure that to
keep that a mystery.
A mystery, right? Yeah. So it's that there's something, I guess, appealing about it too a little bit, that I understand that they're all products of the time, and I do get that. But there is virtually no one that disputes that Cobb was a virulent racist, that Ty Cobb was a player that was maybe kind to say ill-tempered. And to have his record erased by a star of the Negro Leagues in Josh Gibson, arguably by many people of the contemporaries of the time, maybe the most underrated player in now Major League Baseball history. There's something poetic and fitting to that, Sandy.
Well,
and I will admit that I quite enjoy the notion.
If you thought Roy Campanella was a great catcher,
yes,
and most people did,
right?
He came to the major leagues late. He was not as good as Josh Gibson as a catcher. Wasn't. In virtually any respect.
Yeah.
And he was great. A Hall of Famer.
MVP. So a terrific day for baseball as a whole, as the leagues become further, now it feels like the integration, as best as it can be done, is complete as the Negro Leagues join the Major League Baseball statistical database, all of it as one, as baseball's history all brought together in one place. Congratulations to everybody involved into baseball for undertaking that effort. Thank you so much for watching the program today. We really do appreciate it. We'll be back at it with more tomorrow. Thanks to Arran Andersen, our friend from Fox 31, taking an opportunity to break down a little bit of the Nuggets' very challenging situation with or without KCP going forward. And remember, they do have those bird rights. They could re-sign him. That's a complicated story. We'll continue to follow it for the next month. The Denver Broncos OTAs continue. We'll be sure to stay on top of that as well. Thanks to Danny Bailey, our producer, for making everything work. Thanks to you for watching it. We'll be back at it tomorrow. For Sandy Clough, I'm Shawn Drotar. We appreciate you spending some time with us today at Mile High Sports.